There's a well-known fact about the later titles in the Elder Scrolls. These games scale with the player. When you start off your adventure, the world is level to your character. The spawns in dungeons, the enemies in the wilds, the random encounters, they're all going to align with your hero's stats. Furthermore, as the game progresses, new enemies appear along with stronger variations of pre-existing ones. The idea is that as these matchups become more difficult, your character is fitted with the proper equipment and skills to deal with them. Thus, the wheels of adventure go round, and the player remains in an appropriate state of flow. Well, there's one way to quickly topple that entire structure: changing the game's difficulty. By tilting the slider one way, you'll end up experiencing a game that has very little challenge. This can be used for pure beginners, or for those who just want to experience the story.
Hello, good sir.
Meanwhile, if you slice that slider in the other direction, every battle, no matter the encounter, is a fight for your life. This option is clearly for masochists and people who like being miserable. Well, in today's video, I thought I'd try my hand at a Dark Brotherhood max difficulty run in the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. I've never played on max difficulty before. In fact, I don't think I've ever bumped that slider past the middle point. So, in order to try it out for the first time, I thought I'd do it with one of my favorite questlines. You know, just to really soil my opinion and make me resent it. No, the main reason I picked the Dark Brotherhood though is that it isn't overly focused on combat. It's a great way to get me accustomed to a beefed up Cyrodiil and the new gameplay. Furthermore, I've been wanting to do a run where I only use the equipment and abilities that come from a specific questline. So, adding another log to the fire, I'll be playing through this story while only using items and spells that come from contracts/quests. I'll get further into the details as the video goes on, but for now, let's meet my champion for this challenge run. I didn't want to go with anything too complicated, especially considering that this idea is already kind of complicated. My aim was to roll through this questline with something akin to an assassin build. I didn't quite like all of the skills and attributes on the pre-build, so I made something close to it. For starters, I went with a Khajiit as my race. I really wanted to take advantage of the racial buffs of agility and sneak. From there, I debated on going with the thief or the shadow as my birth sign. Originally, I was leaning towards the latter, but I didn't have a strict stance on magic use just yet. I thought I wanted it to be one way, but it kind of went in another direction. I'll explain more in just a bit. For now though, I decided to stick with the basics and take those extra buffs to agility, luck, and speed. Then comes the bread and butter to this character, their class. I knew I wasn't going to use the alchemy skill, and I knew that intelligence would be a poor choice for a favorite attribute. So my created class has a specialization in stealth, my favorite attributes are strength and agility, and then my surefire picks for skills were blade, sneak, marksman, light armor, acrobatics, and athletics. I needed one more, but nothing really stood out to me. I looked at security and thought, will I really be picking that many locks? The answer is yes, 100% always yes. However, thinking that would just be a throwaway skill, I decided to lock in my 7th pick as blunt. That turned out to be arguably the most neglected selection that I could have made, but what's done is done. With Litterbox ready to take on the world, I was eager to see what it was like in a beefed up Cyrodiil. Well, the answer to that is scary. Very, very scary. This is now a world where I have to fear rats, the biggest nuisance of the nuisance creatures. What would upper scale enemies like bandits, imps, or wolves be like? Furthermore, how about my contracts? More than a handful of them involve me taking my target head on. These were all questions that soon get answers, and most of them I'd regret asking. However, first things first, something that I already knew was going to be a crux for this playthrough: joining the Dark Brotherhood. I had to murder an innocent NPC. Normally, that's a pretty easy task. You might incur the wrath of the guards or receive some resistance, but if you pick the right target, it should be a walk through the market district. However, on max difficulty, that's far from the case. My go-to sacrifice is usually Simplicia the Slow. She's probably not the most efficient choice, but she does provide some convenience. Yet for this playthrough, assassinating her was practically impossible. Normally, a few 1-2s do the trick, but not on max. Simplicia's health just wasn't going down. Furthermore, with the guards hot on my tail, I had to be extra cautious. A couple of slashes or a well-placed arrow would mean the end for Litterbox. If the guards caught wind of my assault, I wouldn't have the luxury of finishing what I had started. For those who are unaware, the difficulty slider changes the overall damage dealt to enemies as well as the damage dealt to your character. In the center position, it's an even 1-for-1. Minus the variables of skills and attributes, your steel sword deals 6 damage to the enemy and theirs deals 6 damage to you. If you slide the meter all the way to the left, you now deal 6 times more damage to enemies and they deal 1/6 of the damage to you. So your steel sword now inflicts 36 hit points and theirs only deals 1. Now, slide the meter all the way to the right, you'll find yourself in the reverse position. Every fight is agony. Mud crabs, rats, and slaughterfish will have you running for the gerils. It truly is meant to be a challenge for those who are willing to take it on. It's funny, the unofficial Elder Scrolls pages says that if you're fighting hand to hand, kind of like Litterbox, you should at least have 50 points into strength. Even though I was only 5 off, I could definitely feel the deficit. Killing just about any NPC was impossible. I went down a rabbit hole of trying to find someone I could best, but it just wasn't clicking. You're about to see those greatest hits now. Simplicia's health wasn't dropping fast enough, so I decided to try out some of the easier suggestions that I saw online. Targets that, if they died, I wouldn't receive any bounty whatsoever. A big one I kept seeing was Caminalda, the subject for the Anvil Mages Guild recommendation. According to multiple sources, it's considered a murder if you attack her on the road before she speaks. Well, the hard part wasn't necessarily timing the attack, it was landing that final hit. Caminalda was extremely strong. She always bested the 2 battle mages, and in search of further carnage, she'd set her sights on me. This either resulted in Litterbox dying, or some other third party getting the last lick in. Upon her death, the message never triggered, so I assumed that it had to be me who initiated the fight and delivered the final blow. Now, I will be getting into the specifics for what gear and spells I can use during the questline itself. But for now, just trying to pay cover and get inside of the club, I had some gray area on Litterbox's loadout. For the most part, I tried not to use anything that he didn't already have on him, so I stayed away from new weapons and armor. Furthermore, I didn't really want to use any of his spells either. That one did go down the drain though, as I dabbled with Litter's Eye of Fear ability. But for the most part, I wanted him to try and stay as natural as possible. Back to the matter at hand, after what was probably a dozen attempts, it just wasn't working with Caminalda. I'm pretty sure there was even a point where I let off the killing blow, but clearly I had done something wrong, as again, the message never triggered. Thinking about it now, I probably had to attack her well before she even began her approach. There's an awkward phase where she just sort of stands around and waits for the player to get close enough. I wonder if during that time, a well-placed arrow or flare would have actually done the trick. Maybe I wouldn't have even needed to be the one to throw the final punch, but at this point, it's in the past. Moving along, I had my eureka moment. Why didn't I just head for the Inn of Ill Omen and kill Rufio before a knife in the dark even starts? Genius, right? Well, not really. It turns out Rufio, the alleged long-standing guest of the tavern, doesn't even exist in the game yet. So that idea left as quickly as it came. No matter, the next point on this list was a softball, in theory. Skingrad is home to some less than savory characters. Among them is the beloved Glarthur. Apparently, if Glarthur is attacked and killed during the quest Paranoia, that should be enough to attract the Brotherhood. Blindsiding the Bosmer outside of the church, it didn't end very well. The Wood Elf threw some solid hooks and uppercuts. Those were enough to knock Litterbox's lights right out. Furthermore, attacking Glarthur before he fully dives off the deep end is considered a crime. So now needing to tackle both him and the guards, I needed to think of a Plan E stat. This is what brings me over to Breville's Skooma Den. It's home to more than a few couch potatoes. These are NPCs who spend every waking moment slugging back that sweet, sweet moon sugar. What's more, no narcs allowed, so whatever goes down in there is between me and the gang. Shouldn't be an issue to take at least one of them on, right? Well, as it would turn out, on the highest difficulty, these addicts became prime Mike Tysons. Similar to Glarthur, a well-timed heavy attack sends my Khajiit straight to Aetherius. Then on my end, I'm lucky if I can drop their health down to 3/4. Even after breaking my rules that technically weren't set yet, i.e. consumables and spells outside of the questline, I'd still get my tail rocked. At this point, I don't know if I'd fully say I was losing hope, but I was starting to get pretty worried. Even the quote freebies were kicking Litterbox back to elsewhere. I kept trying and trying, but still no dice. I was running out of alternatives and thought, what else could I do here? Well, as it would just so happen, Lorcan himself sent me a sign. After giving up on Roxanne Bridget, the only NPC who apparently has a small chance of narking, I started to smack Jazindar instead, purely out of frustration. Well, this was my true eureka moment. Jazindar didn't care. He'd get out of bed, look around for a moment, and then go back to sleep. Not wanting to somehow mess this chance up, I spam-clicked the mouse button until it was practically red hot. With fated breath, I watched my fellow Khajiit drop dead and saw that initiation message pop up on my screen. Finally, my adventure through the Dark Brotherhood could actually begin. All in, it took me well over an hour to get this one kill off. That is way longer than I expected, but in truth, it was just a foreshadow of what was to come. Finally though, I could start the storyline and I got my first piece of usable gear. The Blade of Woe was a humble dagger, but it was at least something to kick off this journey of mine. So, the very first mission for the Dark Brotherhood is of course a knife in the dark. I was very curious on how this one would go. Rufio is placed at level 1 with a total HP amount of 1. He is normally an incredibly easy mark. How does max difficulty affect this though? Well, it doesn't. One slash with the Blade of Woe and he was still down for the count. It makes sense, as even though the most damage I could do with the dagger is 1, that's obviously still enough to send him straight to Sithis. Now, really quick, this is a great time to explain how looting works for this playthrough. I can use any items that were given to me by the Dark Brotherhood or that were taken from a person or scene tied to the faction. Rufio's corpse, free game. The Inn of Ill Omen, also free game. The woods outside the tavern, or for example, the nearby Alien Ruin, off limits. Mannheim Mallhand or any other visiting NPC, also off limits. If there was no direct tie or link to the faction, I wasn't going to bother with looting. As the questline goes on, you'll get a better grasp of the guidelines. For now, it's off to the Sanctuary. This is obviously within limits and probably the best resource for my character. Meeting with Ochiva, she gave me the Shrouded Armor set. This is huge for the budding assassin, as those buffs go a long way for just about any stealth-oriented class. This is actually something that didn't sit well with me though, but I'll talk about it soon enough. Next, I could really take advantage of what was around the Sanctuary. The training room and living quarters had skill books, potions, poisons, ingredients, weapons, and other armor pieces. There were repair hammers, locks, and torches that could be used as the story went on. Furthermore, the most insufferable NPC in the guild would end up becoming my greatest asset. Mirage Dar's services were open for business. Selling off duplicates of gear, miscellaneous goods, or impractical consumables would help offset costs of more useful things like poisons, potions, lockpicks, and soul gems. I felt like I had a really good system going here, and I was super eager to get into that first official contract. I had already begun to think about a watery grave and what it might entail, a duel with Captain Tussaud and a bunch of angry pirates. I also envisioned the kind of loot I could find on the Maria Elena, steel cutlasses, gems, booty, and whatever kind of goods were stashed below deck. For the time being, I tried to stay as incognito as possible. While part of the challenge was running through this story on hard mode, which really only affects the game's combat, that didn't necessarily mean I had to go out of my way to fight people. When push came to shove, I'd do what I could, but otherwise, it was best to play things smart. While aboard the ship, I helped myself to as much loot as possible. This included things like grains, books, pelts, clothes, silverware, anything that could fetch me a piece of gold or two. If I was lucky, I'd manage to catch some weapons and armor, like a fur cuirass and an iron war axe. There isn't necessarily much shock value there, but considering I was limited to what was around, better to build that arsenal early on. As for Gaston Tussaud, I had some ideas on how to deal with him. As soon as I took aggro, I ran back out to the waterfront and looked around for a guard. Not seeing a single one, I legged it into the bloated float and brought the party inside. This was enough to push back the pirates, but there was one issue. Captain Tussaud was nowhere to be found. So, returning to the Maria Elena, this time I made sure that Gaston was right behind me. Him and first mate Malvolus followed Litterbox until I'd passed them over to a watchman. If you're curious how I would have fared in this fight, I might as well have just used a stick. My slashes and stabs were hardly making a dent in the captain's health. Realistically, the watchman was the one who finished the contract, but in the end, the Dark Brotherhood doesn't give a hoot about the finer details. Before leaving, I made sure to grab all that I could from the Maria Elena without causing any more of a ruckus. When ready, I returned to the sanctuary and cashed in with Vicente. The reward for this one is the Black Band, the only ring that my character got to use for this entire playthrough. However, I did get to secure some nice weapon upgrades like the Steel Cutlass. Furthermore, I also snagged some starting armor like a fur cuirass, helmet, and boots. So, remember earlier when I mentioned that something was bugging me with the shrouded armor? Well, while it was technically within the guidelines to use, ultimately I decided to put it to the side. The set worked a little too well. I knew for a fact that I wouldn't have found an upgrade for it until practically endgame territory. The whole point of this run-through is to try and keep the ball rolling with gear replacements and consumables. The shrouded armor would have made me too complacent, and it would have taken away all of the future possibilities for armor upgrades. So because of that, I'll be donning the almost complete first set. Either way, for this next quest, Accidents Happen, there was a very cut and dry approach to it. What I was wearing and the weapons I was using wouldn't have much of an effect on the outcome. Infiltrate Banelin's house via the basement, work my way up to the top floor, and from there, loosen the fastenings. The fun part is looting and stealing from Banelin's home. Again, I wouldn't say that he had anything extraordinary. There were some items like potions and books that would fetch decent prices with Mirage. There were also some weapons and armor stashed away in the spare room. Not necessarily things I'd use, but they were interesting nonetheless. Once I've taken my heart's desire, the rest of the quest went as programmed. I dropped the Minotaur's head on Banelin, and Grom rushed to his side. Feeling greedy and like I wanted one last score, I took the change from the Nord's pockets and tiptoed my way out of the house. The bonus for this quest was probably one of the most useful items I could have received. Sufferthorn's ability to drain strength and damage health goes a long way for this max difficulty run. At this rate, I'll take whatever leverage I can get. The next contract would end up being the most interesting one yet. For the most part, scheduled for execution is reliant mostly on stealth, especially if you want that bonus. However, I knew that when it came down to it, it'd be me and Dren duking it out in the dungeons. What's more, the worst part was probably in the beginning. You see, the sewers leading up to the Imperial Sanctum are filled with nuisance creatures, rats and mud crabs. Normally, I'd be laughing at them, but in my current condition, I was downright terrified. The mud crabs took me ages to kill, and the rats were extremely dangerous. One at a time was a challenge, but a 2v1, that was nightmare fuel. Stealth attacks would end up really making a difference, especially with the rats. Surprisingly, a well-placed arrow could end a fight before it even began. The trade-off with the crabs was that they were a little hardier, but it was easier to predict their attack patterns. So really, all they did was stall for time. Honestly though, the sewer portion took up most of my time for this quest. The actual crawl through the sanctum was business as usual. Slip past the guards undetected. If I ended up getting caught, well, there was no mercy whatsoever, but that's what reloads are for. Finally making it to the cell block, I readied myself for what was to come and let Valen out of his cage. Admittedly, I thought he'd mostly run away and scream for help, but to my surprise, he came right at me. The fight was pretty close. I did better than I thought I would have, aka I came out on top during my first try. That was all thanks to Sufferthorn though, as that extra effect on an enemy's health gave me that edge. Unfortunately, not too much to walk away with here in terms of loot. Really, I just had a better sense of self-worth for Litterbox, and in some ways, that's better than a new axe or vintage wine. Turning in the contract, Valtieri rewards me with some gold and the scales of pitiless justice, allowing for buffs to strength, agility, and intelligence. Cashing in with Mirage Dar, I'd built up a pretty strong bankroll. This made way for more poisons, potions, and lockpicks. If I was smart, I would have also looked into some of his spells. Unfortunately, this is something that completely escaped me, and I only remembered to look after it was too late. Rest assured though, I did find other ways to expand my spellbook, so stay tuned for those. For now, it's off to the final mission given out by Vicente. The assassinated man was as straightforward as it gets. Entering Motier's space, the loot was ripe for the picking. As Hydes' heart and Francois went back and forth, I helped myself to the Breton's wine rack, display cases, chests, and potions. As I was coming back down from Motier's quarters, Hydes' heart gave me a proper jump scare. I thought he'd be focusing his attention on Francois, but nope, go after the guy who's essentially doing the job for you. If anything, I think it sends a scarier message if the Dark Brotherhood's the one going around taking out the people who missed payments. As soon as Motier was dealt with and Hydes' heart had skipped town, I was free to return back to Francois' home. I just wanted to be thorough with my looting. I had hopes and dreams of buying items like Perdition's Wrath and the Bow of Infernal Frost. They're each valued at an Oblivion ton of wine bottles, but it's always nice to set some goals. Whether or not they're attainable though is up for debate. When finished, I closed out the quest and went through the rest of the motions. Healing Motier, I pretty much just cheered him on as he duked it out with his Aunt Margaret. I was barely putting a dent in the Motier zombie's health. Meanwhile, Francois was battering this thing to pieces. I never really thought about it, but NPC on NPC violence should still roughly be the same. It's only when it comes to the hero of Kvatch that multipliers get put into place. So, while I was supposed to be the one who protected Francois, he ended up being my guardian angel. I thought about having Motier take on every single zombie down here, but ultimately, I wanted to ensure his safety. The reward from the Brotherhood would go a lot further than some mort flesh and pieces of parchment. So, gunning it for the Grey Mare, the Breton and I parted ways and it was back to the Sanctuary. Valtieri gave me Cruelty's Heart, so more buffs to willpower and strength, as well as the key to the outside well. This was probably the best gift of all, as you can't put a price on convenience. Furthermore, I thought long and hard about this next decision, and decided that, yeah, I want to go for it. I wanted to become a vampire. I should take every opportunity to exploit the guild for what it has to offer. I think there are a lot of perks from Stage 1 vampirism that I can benefit from. There are also a lot of downsides to the affliction, aka stages 2, 3, and 4, but so long as I stayed on top of feeding, everything should come up Millhouse, right? In any case, this was my first time playing as a beast folk and turning into a vampire, so therefore, it could have been my first time seeing a Khajiit vamp in Oblivion. Pretty neat. In any case, the show goes on with the next contract, The Lonely Wanderer. Admittedly, this one didn't really pose much of a challenge either. I was able to track down both Atrena and Phalion through the power of persuasion. Most of the items from this quest were considered owned, so nothing was going to fetch me a sale with Mirage Dar. While I understand that making Dar an unofficial fence would have stepped on the Thieves Guild's toes, lore-wise I don't see why not. I'm sure most of his contacts are criminals or members of the faction anyways. What are a few stolen swords and silver vases going to do for his reputation? Even though Lorkmir was dead and his house would go on to be untouched until the next era, get it? Nothing was free for the taking. I helped myself to some of the nearby skooma, just in case I'd be needing it, but otherwise the rest of the events were pretty cut and dry. As for Phalion, well, he initially fought back with his iron dagger, taking away a sliver of my health, but after that he just sort of ran around the main floor. I don't think he realized just how much power he had over me, but hey, that works in my favor. Sufferthorn did the job perfectly, Phalion dropped dead in a secluded area, and that was it for this one. As a bonus, Ochiva gifted me with the bow Shadowhunt. This would end up being my go-to ranged weapon for quite some time. Now, I will say at this point, I'd begun to develop some opinions on the Dark Brotherhood at max difficulty. The earlier quests don't call for too much combat. In fact, it's in your best interest to avoid all that extra fluff, as that's where the bonuses come into play. Again though, since the difficulty really only affects combat, I don't find myself all that affected by the cranked up slider. I have had moments where I take a step back and go, wow, that would be a nightmare to deal with, or that was a nightmare to deal with, but no hard roadblocks. Nothing like that first initiation into the guild. In fact, the first 9 quests for this faction are all pretty similar in terms of required combat. Like for example, this next one, Bad Medicine, had me sneaking into Fort Such and assassinating a bedridden man. Other than that though, I get a better reward if I don't try and take on his group of guards. I will say, once those 9 contracts are up though, the stakes do get higher and the difficulty level is better reflected. While crawling through Fort Such, I was able to make good use out of my vampiric abilities. In the past, I've had a hard time navigating through this dungeon. I find that Roderick's guards cover a wide area and that their movements can be quite sporadic. However, using Hunter's Sight allows me to detect life over a great distance. It also grants me with Night Eye. I can't stand the blue night vision, but if it means a simpler time sneaking around, I'll go for it. Also worth mentioning is that at this point, I've put my racial ability, Eye of Fear, to the side and am only using spells that are tied to my time in the faction, i.e. magic that comes from being a vampire. What's done is done, but at least I could go through the rest of this questline as intended. While I could have spent more time looting the dungeon, I was just too eager to get into the next contract. I knew it'd end up providing more of a challenge, and the loot at Summit Miss Manor would be even more fruitful. I will say, on my way out, I encountered something I haven't quite dealt with before. One of the guards was just not moving from her patrol. She was essentially blocking off my escape. I waited around for a good long while. I'm sure I could have waited even longer, and she maybe would have moved, but not having that kind of patience, I decided to just bulldoze through. Now, when I first arrived at Fort Such, I noticed that if I engaged with her in combat, the journal update saying that I forfeited the bonus would take a while to pop up. In one case, it almost felt like I could have bested her in direct combat and the notification wouldn't have appeared. Well, testing out that theory, it ended up being true. I dragged Lena Phil all the way outside and into the Clovian Highlands. I pelted her with arrows, came out relatively unscathed, and still received my bonus for remaining undetected. It was definitely a strange occurrence. I wondered where exactly the game drew the line on getting spotted, and I guess being in close proximity to Roderick and the rest of his gang. Either way, it's like getting paid more than you actually earned. You take it and keep your mouth shut. As a bonus, Ochiva gifted me with the Deceiver's Finery, the torso piece that'll help Litterbox become a little more likable. While I didn't walk away with too many treasures, I was able to sell off what I had to Mirage Dar and secure even more potions and poisons. Well, now it's off to more exciting times. Whodunit is my favorite Dark Brotherhood quest, and the possible outcomes, twists, turns, and quote, wrenches in plans are numerous. Plus, like I said earlier, Summit Miss Manor has some pretty decent loot that I can get a hold of. At the very least, it's valuable stuff. Arriving in Skingrad, the first thing I did was scout out the house. I filled my pockets with whatever I could find. I had about 200 units of weight to work with, and a lot of that ended up getting occupied by weapons, armor, and alcohol. I even found some paintbrushes, which would end up being a gift from Sithis himself. Those become staples for a very specific upcoming quest. I still needed to scour the upper level, but first, I decided to start knocking some names off of the list. Mathilde Petite was the easiest target to isolate. She asked me if we could work together, and I told her, sure, meet me down in the basement, alone. This would end up being the real test. What would it be like killing off the 5 targets? Well, in all my time of doing the Dark Brotherhood questline, I never once realized that Mathilde had the old Rufio build, level 1 with a total of 1 health point. I got into Stealth Archer mode, busted out Shadow Hunt, and dipped my arrow in a deadly poison. Of course, she ended up dying upon impact. Mathilde never stood a chance. What's more though, I had no clue that all 5 of these NPCs were built just like that. Nels, Dovesi, Neville, and Primo all dropped like flies as well. I guess I always just assumed that stealth attacks worked wonders here, but in reality, everyone's just super frail. Even with max difficulty, a swift arrow puts them right out of commission. I literally had to double check that my slider was still cranked as I couldn't believe it for myself. After filling my pockets to the brim and all but maxing out my total weight, I finished off the last of the party guests, and that was that. Other than Primo, no one knew I was the killer, and seemingly even him knowing didn't affect my bonus. I came out unscathed and full of riches. Returning to Ochiva, she rewarded me with some gold and the Night Mother's blessing, even more buffs for my relevant skills. Honestly, maybe I should have kept all of Neville's Legionnaire gear, as in a few quests, I'd be thrown into some direct duels. However, certain consumables were way more beneficial than a suit of armor. I knew that eventually, these poisons would become my bread and butter. After Dar's supply gets cut off, that's it. I'd have to work with whatever I had offhand. Moving on to the next quest, Permanent Retirement, this one is more or less already served to the player on a silver platter. The Rose of Sithis is incredibly overpowered. As soon as it makes contact with an unarmored Philida, you might as well have that old Rufio build. The retired guard captain drops dead in an instant. Really, the tricky part to this contract didn't even have to do with the quest itself. It of course had to deal with vampirism. I neglected my feeding schedule, and because of that, stage 2 of the affliction set in. At first, I was curious on if sun damage was somehow ramped up with the difficulty increase, but yeah, that didn't end up being the case. Instead of finding someone to feed on, I decided to just wait it out, steamroll through the pain, and set up the shot. I caught Adamus with his pants down in the water. As my Khajiit's skin burned, the arrow flew through the air and struck the retired captain. In a rather comedic way, his bodyguard saw what happened and just left. I guess he knew he wasn't getting paid anymore and said, off to the next one. Adamus had some goodies on him, ranging from some gold to gear all the way to half a dozen different keys. Even though I now had his finger, I wasn't going anywhere with all this sun damage. While the additional benefits to my attributes were tempting, my health was just getting torn apart. So, finally finding someone to feed on, Litterbox was back to normal. Now, all I had to do was deposit the finger in the new guard captain's desk, and that was a wrap. Funnily enough, this was easier said than done. The new guy really liked the office, and that made it difficult to get in there undetected. However, wrapping around from the other side managed to do the trick, and before long, I was back at the sanctuary. Really, the bonus for this contract was a hefty coin purse, although that would more than come in handy for this upcoming quest. From here on out, the experience changes. The slow pitches are over and done with, there's no more mercy, and very little room for error. This next task was a prime example for all of those things. It was finally time for the purification. This quest had been on my mind well before I even started this challenge. I knew this was going to be a crux point, and honestly, I wasn't entirely sure how I'd deal with it. For starters, I did my very last transaction with Mirage Dar. I waved goodbye to Perdition's Wrath and the Bow of Infernal Frost. Maybe if I had saved all of the gold I'd ever gotten and sold way more items, I could have afforded the axe, but what's done is done. Again, those poisons, particularly the paralysis ones, would end up going a long way for future contracts. If I had only saved up for a new weapon, well, I'm really not sure how events would have played out. Either way, when ready to wave off my old life, I traveled to Fort Farragut and met with LeChance. Of course, for this project, Lucian gives me a scroll to summon the ghost of Rufio, hopefully no 1/1 build, and also a poisoned apple. Scavenging the rest of Lucian's hideout, I had to be much more mindful of what I picked up. I no longer had a merchant that I could sell things to. Whatever I grabbed from questing areas or NPCs, I had to make sure that I had a use for it, as otherwise it was just going to waste. Well, ready to take on the entire sanctuary, the first guildmate I put my attention on was Vicente Valtieri. After reading a private note between him and Ochiva, I took advantage of his garlic sensitivity and put a couple of cloves down his pants. In said note, the fellow vamp said that he becomes much weaker if he comes into contact with the vegetable. Expecting that whole Rufio build, I tried my luck at a powerful sneak attack and witnessed the true might of max difficulty. Valtieri essentially ate my arrow and slaughtered me on the spot. The garlic sneak attack combo did absolutely nothing. I tried again with Sufferthorn, poisons, and an undetected heavy attack, still no dice. This felt like it was the questline's way of making up for all of the ease I've experienced thus far. Luckily, with Vicente, he was one of the few NPCs who was peeved enough to follow me through the well. I was able to bring him over to the guard at Aldos Othrin's place. Once there, the Watchman took over the fight, plus the sun damage helped to shred through Valtieri's health. Before long, the first of my marks had dropped dead, but it would end up being one of the easier encounters. The next person I set my sights on was Antoinetta Marie. Baiting her over to the well, this was where I found out that Vicente was one of a kind. None of my other guildmates would follow me through this exit. I'd head on up, not see anyone, climb back down, and watch on as my mark dropped their aggro. I had tried to pull her over a few more times, but she'd never go through the well with me. Stumped on what to do, I had another eureka moment. Coming back down, I saw that Marie was nested in the well's dugout for a few seconds. After those were up, she'd wander off and the encounter would reset. However, I thought of the perfect execution method. I call it the pen. With the opening being about as narrow as a doorway, I could exploit the paintbrush glitch, place two of them in the air, and block off any possible exit point. Now, with Antoinetta trapped, I could pelt her with arrows from afar. This worked well, But of course, arrows are finite resources. Eventually, I was going to run out. So this was where I pivoted to the classic hand on the forehead technique. Marie hacked and slashed away with her dagger. This meant she had a pretty poor reach with her weapon. Taking out my silver longsword, I found the perfect distance to be able to hit her while staying clear of her range. I was able to spam click the left mouse button and watched on as her health slowly drained. Honestly, with the amount of hits it took to kill her, I was shocked. I must have made contact at least 200 or so times. I couldn't imagine going through this without the use of an exploit. Again, maybe I could have done one, but to repeat that 6 times over, I'd probably still be working on it as we speak. Especially with Gogren Grobalmog. Balmog's armor was practically impenetrable for this playthrough. What's more, he actually had the reach. His battle axe could go the distance, literally. So, for the orc, I had to mostly rely on ranged attacks in the pen. What's more, to save on ammunition, Gogren was the target I summoned Rufio for. Old Rufio put in the work, and truthfully, I don't think I could have done it without him. I certainly didn't have that many arrows in my inventory. Once Balmog was dealt with, the next person I worked on was Ochiva. I had an easier time dealing with her in the pen, but there was one variable I hadn't counted on, the Dark Guardian. During my assault of the previous 3 guildmates, the decked out skeleton didn't care at all. As I slashed away, the undead protector just walked in circles around the room. However, when it came to Ochiva, that's where the Guardian drew the line. Upon attacking the Argonian, the skeleton would lunge at me almost immediately. At first, I wasn't sure how I was going to deal with it. This thing had me outmatched in every category. Luckily though, as the old saying goes, necessity is the mother of invention. Or rather, my version, cowardice breeds exploitation. Leaving the sanctuary through the main entranceway, the Guardian ended up following me. I don't know why I was so surprised at this. I guess I just assumed that this thing would stay at its designated post. Dragging it all the way outside, the watchman from Aldos's house worked double overtime. It didn't take him nearly as long to deal with this opponent as it did Vicenti, so in a way that helped me for time. Returning to the sanctuary, I re-trapped Ochiva in the pen and gave her the Antoinetta treatment. Longsword at a distance, stayed out of reach from her dagger. Again, the whole encounter took forever. It was a mix of weapon condition, overall stamina, and of course, the fact that I was dealing 1/6 of the damage. However, I grew even more grateful for those paintbrushes, as those were literally carrying this quest. Oh, and the guard by the house. Can't forget about him either. With only a handful of guildmates left, the next one I focused on was my greatest asset, Mirage Dar. Our time wheeling and dealing together had come to an end. If I can't have his services, then no one can. Since the fellow Khajiit was a spellcaster, I decided to just kite him outside. While there was a chance that at a certain angle, the pen maybe could have blocked his casts, I wasn't going to test it out. Instead, I let the real professional killer handle this one. I did try to help, but in doing so, I just kinda got in the way and was penalized for it. So instead, I took a step back and let the two duke it out. Once my fence was dead, I only had to work on 2 more NPCs. Deciding to target Telangel next, she'd actually end up being the most difficult mark. The Wood Elf was the only archer amongst the crew. Therefore, the pen was more than likely not going to work. No matter, I could just bring her outside, right? Well, yeah, but she certainly took her time meandering through the corridors. She preferred to stand as far away as possible and waited for me to stick my neck out. The Bosmer was certainly the smartest of the crew, but that wasn't even the worst part. She was the only one who could actually best the Watchman. In a 1v1, Telangel would come on top and then set her sights back on me. Those arrows were deadly too, as all it took was 1 shot to end Litterbox. After half a dozen attempts, me and Boromir finally bested her. It's crazy too because she was just using a steel bow and had steel arrows. Nothing fancy, yet she beat the guardsman. Maybe one day, Litterbox will be as strong as her on max difficulty. Who knows? Then, the very last NPC I needed to deal with was of course Tainava. The Argonian was a walk in the park compared to marks like Gogren and Telangel. I set him up in the pen, used my longsword, and stayed away from his dagger. As soon as my final guildmate had dropped dead, it was like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. It was a bittersweet moment. It was obviously the most difficult contract I've had to deal with thus far, but it was also the most satisfying. I got a true taste of hard mode and came to a realization. If this were any other questline, minus the Thieves Guild, I'd be royally screwed. I know the UESP has a whole beginner's guide to max difficulty on their website, but I'm really curious on how people actually go about playing this way. If you have a max difficulty run, I'd love to hear about it down below, as this is a brand new world for me. In any case, with the Shadenhall Sanctuary purged, I was ready to move on to grander projects. I've always found that the back 9 of this questline was less technical, so what I've been dealing with, and more direct, arena-style combat. The first dead drop contract, not so much, but the preceding ones, absolutely. First up was dealing with Keladane in Leafrot Cave. As a side note, I think this was the furthest I've ever traveled through Cyrodiil while on horseback. It took me ages to get to the dungeon. At first, I tried cutting through the Niben Bay, but on Shadowmere, I'd still be swimming through it to this day. So instead, I went from Hero Hill and rode south. I was probably on the horse for about 5 minutes in real-world time, but in-game, it felt like half an hour. On the way to the cave, I passed by so many wolves and bandits. It was kind of surreal knowing that if I had stopped at all, I'd probably be dead in a matter of moments. Although I will say, while on horseback, my steed takes the brunt of the damage. So in a way, Shadowmere was literally my meat shield for this max difficulty run. Unfortunately, I can't attack from horseback, so really, all I get from it is extra protection while going from point A to point B. In this world though, I'll take any edge I can get. Arriving at Leafrot, the task ahead was pretty interesting. It was similar to Scheduled for Execution and Bad Medicine, but I didn't have to actually worry about the lackeys in the cave. If I was spotted, so what? Well, not necessarily. For the most part, I was dealing with rats and skeletons. The former was easy enough to work around, but the latter, getting detected by those, was a death sentence. To be honest though, while they did do a number on my health, I never really tried to fight back. I just sort of accepted my fate. I was more so focused on stealthily making it through the cave, but in hindsight, maybe I should have dueled at least one of the undead, just to see how I'd actually fare. Either way, didn't fully matter. I was eventually able to get past the entranceway and made it over to Keladane. Timing my approach, a simple pickpocket later and the quest was over. I did a once-over on Leafrot, but again, at this point, if there weren't any consumables or gear upgrades, I wasn't going to take it. With that being said though, I did find a pretty wicked warhammer in one of the coffins. The warhammer of weight inflicted 10 points of burden for 15 seconds. Not the craziest find by any means, but it was nice to actually get an enchanted drop. Leaving Leafrot, I no longer cared about detection. Mounting Shadowmere, I had that extra layer of health. Moreover, I was able to book it out of there in no time, so there was no shot that the skeletons were going to catch up. This next quest was another one I had thought about ahead of time. I foresaw this contract as being another crux point. On normal difficulty, Next of Kin already has its challenges, i.e. Kalia and Matthias Draconis. On max difficulty though, I knew that all 5 family members would pose as threats. For example, Perennia was genuinely a scary encounter. With the combined might of Jake, her dog, I hardly stood a chance in direct combat. The duo slaughtered me at every turn. What's more, there were no narrow openings at Applewatch. Creating a pen here was practically impossible with only 2 paintbrushes. After trying several methods, including poison apples, I've finally caught my lucky break. Perennia had left the cottage to go and farm. She was away from Jake and relatively isolated at the base of the Gerals. I feel terrible for wording it like this, but there was no chance of her getting help. Taking out Sufferthorn and dipping it in a poison, I was able to blindside the matron and make quick work of her. A while back, I talked big game about these elixirs coming in handy. Well, here I am. This is where the mixtures really started to shine. The next NPC I ended up targeting was Sibylla. Admittedly, I misread the map and thought I was headed for Andreas, but at the end of the day, they were the next 2 on my list anyway. Reaching the feral Draconis was quite interesting. She's obviously held up in Muck Valley Cavern, surrounded by a bunch of wild animals. Luckily, at my current level, these creatures were just rats. A handful of well-placed arrows later, and I was home free, more or less. As expected, Sibylla was a beast. With just a few blows, her mace was able to crush my health bar. For some reason, I've always had trouble sneaking up to Sibylla, so I just sort of assumed that a direct approach was the only option. However, today was the day that I proved myself wrong. Dipping an arrow in a paralysis potion, I fired it from the shadows and watched her body drop. Taking advantage of the moment, I switched to Sufferthorn and sprinted in. I could actively feel my blood pressure rise as Sibylla started to get up. Not wanting to take any chances, I used my second last paralysis potion and continued to slash away. She was almost dead with just a sliver of health left, but again, she started to stand up. Having zero faith in my abilities, I dipped Sufferthorn in a weak poison of sickness and sealed the deal. Mug Valley Cavern didn't really have that many useful items in it, so I took what little I could and left the dungeon. I haven't really touched on it in some time, but remember, during this entire playthrough, I was managing my vampirism. For the most part, I was able to comfortably stay within the first two stages. Traveling around the map would become a small nuisance. If I landed somewhere during the day, I'd obviously have to take shelter until either nightfall or my next meal. Luckily, Andreas was easy enough to get to at the Drunken Dragon Inn. I pretty much arrived just as the sun was coming up. In many ways, I'd consider him the easiest Draconis to deal with. Normally, it's as simple as baiting him with his mother's death and letting the Imperial officer take the reins. Technically, I still think that's the best way to go about it, but on max difficulty, I really had to try and stay away from him. Usually, it's simple enough to block his attacks and let the Legionnaire go to work. But with a multiplier of 6 working against me, I had to be quick on my toes here. Andreas would go on to best me more than the other members of the family. It likely all comes down to underestimating him and not taking the necessary precautions. However, after a few attempts, I finally watched the life fade from his eyes and was free to move on to the next mark. In terms of loot for the Drunken Dragon Inn, again, unfortunately there was nothing remarkable or useful, just clothing, food, and alcohol. Plus, with the Legionnaire hawking me down, I had to be on my best behavior. As expected, the next two Draconises would go on to be the most difficult of the bunch. With Matthias living in the capital and Kalia being a captain of the Leywin Watch, I had to find more discreet ways of eliminating them. Technically, getting arrested wasn't really off the table, as I didn't have too many stolen goods on me. However, I was more so worried about getting caught in the act, resisting arrest, and then having to complete the job with all that extra attention. Because of that precaution, the setup for their deaths took me ages to figure out. At first, I focused on Matthias. I had to nail down his schedule while managing my vampirism. Waiting too long for him to go into work would bring on stages 2 and 3 of my affliction. Realizing this, I was able to shove a poisoned apple into his back pocket and moved over to Leywin. The hope was that while I was away, he'd whip it out at the bloated float, take a couple of bites, and get sent to Sithis. After reaching Leywin though, I realized that probably wasn't going to happen. I didn't get any updates, and I figured I probably never would. I tried the same approach with Kalia, waited for 24 hours, and crossed my fingers. When the timer was up, I didn't get any notifications. So my last resort would be the old-fashioned way. Flipping back to the Imperial City, I tried to ambush Matthias at his workplace. Normally this works, but 1v1 I didn't stand a chance. Plus, Zholring made things awkward, and of course the guards got themselves involved. Oh, and to make matters even better, sun damage from stage 2 vampirism. Honestly, I was starting to regret taking this dark gift, but what's done is done. After a while of what just felt like the old college try, I finally had success by visiting Matthias at his home. While he slept, I set up the perfect pen by his dining area. This time, the script was reversed. I had trapped myself in the corner. Truthfully, I probably could have done that too in the sanctuary. Blocked myself in the well area, and it would have made my life a lot easier. No back and forth kiting to the correct location, but what can you do now? Either way, Matthias did have a few tricks up his sleeve, but nothing crazy. His reach was better than the daggers I've dealt with, but at the end of the day, a short sword isn't that much better. A two-handed weapon still had the edge over his one-handed sword. Finding the appropriate distance took me a few tries, but once I got there, I could smack and smash him all I'd like. He couldn't do a thing about it. After quite some time, the 4th Draconis finally dropped dead, just in the nick of time too. Any longer and I would have been dealing with the guards. Before having to pay a rather lax fine, I did manage to swipe Matthias' chainmail armor. This would serve as a long overdue upgrade for every single gear slot. It's ironic too, because my whole reasoning for not using the shrouded armor was that it would have limited my opportunity for upgrades. Yet, I've been stuck with the same kit since a watery grave, so in a way, what was the point? In any case, it was now time for the final child, the one I had been dreading the most. I more or less knew Kalia's patrol patterns from previous run-throughs. I figured the best place to ambush her was while she was alone at the Three Sisters Inn. My biggest fear though was her ability to rally the guards. Normally, she's able to summon the watch pretty quickly, especially after taunting her. My one hope was that while isolated on the second floor, it'd just be a slugfest between her and I. No one else would come through and get in the way. So, setting up shop in one of the guest rooms, I initiated the fight and put myself in the pen. I was a little worried at the size of the double doorway, but putting a little more attention into the placement of the brushes did the trick. Getting Kalia stuck on the other side of the pen was only half the battle. I now had to deal with her longsword, and I prayed to Sithis that no one else would be coming through those doors. I couldn't do much about the latter, but I could control the former. I first tried to work in and out of her swings, lunge in and out, letting off an attack and dodging hers. Of course, I failed miserably because I'm not even sure what I was trying to do was possible. So I resorted to archery next. This would have worked if I had the necessary number of arrows. However, I really didn't have that many to begin with, so that idea quickly died too. Thinking about what to do next, I had another eureka moment. Technically, this one wasn't that clever or unique. Kalia's longsword had really good reach, there was no denying that, but it wasn't perfect. In terms of melee combat, a two-handed weapon was the only thing that could one-up it. So, taking out my warhammer, I played around with the keyboard until I found the literal perfect spot to stand in. If I stood further back, my hits wouldn't register. Any closer and I'd be a turkey on Thanksgiving. She'd carve me up in no time. Honestly, it was intimidating standing that close, but it was working. Her health was slowly going down and the guards never came to her aid. After probably 500 or so mouse clicks later, the final Draconis was sent to the void. Next of kin was over and done with, and yet another weight had been lifted from my shoulders. This time though, it was different. I could see the light at the end of the tunnel. This was because I knew exactly how to handle the remaining targets. I had the strategies locked down. Of course, there'd still be some hiccups, but my confidence was at an all-time high. Unfortunately, Kalia's armor didn't exactly come as an upgrade. Matthias's chainmail was still valued at a better armor rating. However, at this point in the story, it didn't matter. I was about to land at my be-all end-all for wearable gear. The next contract was against Jagasta. After suffering through an arrest for who knows what, I made way for Bruma and planned everything out. First things first, entering the Khajiit's home, I got into his keg and snagged the Black Hand hood and robe. These are of course the upgraded versions of the shrouded armor, offering buffed up buffs to the same set of skills. Who knows, maybe those additional 15 points to Blade and Marksman will make drastic differences for my combat. Once ready, I paid a visit to Jagasta and tested the limits. I knew that the guards were bribed to look the other way, but would any of the other NPCs help me? The answer was no. No, they wouldn't. One swift punch from the boxing pro and Litterbox was done. So the most efficient method here was setting up the pen. Measuring the doorways, these were of course perfect for the double paintbrush approach. Given that the Khajiit was using his fists, the weapons with the worst reach in the game, I could resort to just about any weapon choice on my end. Call it karma, but I got cocky and moved closer than I should have. Jagasta got one last laugh in as he clobbered me on the spot. Note to self when using the pen, don't try and let off heavy attacks. That shortens the distance for a mere moment, but that's all it takes to make contact. With Jagasta dead, I took a quick peek around his training area. While none of the items in here really stood out to me, I was still walking away with the Black Hand robes. Those would go on to become arguably the best pickups for this entire playthrough. Up next was the contract on Shaliz. In my opinion, the Argonian has always been the easiest one to eliminate. 1v1 combat, she's definitely a menace, but the fact that she lives so close to Breville, it's incredibly easy to just hand her over to the guards. Technically, that was supposed to be the idea. I'd lure her all the way to the city gates, let the watchman take over, and that would be that. However, I guess I came out of Flooded Mine at the worst possible time. The Countess of Leowin's bodyguard and her advisor were traveling along the road at that exact moment. Normally, this wouldn't be an issue, as the bodyguard could have easily taken care of her. For this instance though, Shaliz ended up aggroing onto Hildara Mothro, the advisor. This frightened the High Elf and sent her running for the hills. What ensued was an unnecessarily long chase sequence. Hildara fled for her life, Shaliz was right behind her, and the bodyguard was tailing the Argonian. The bodyguard was an archer, so it was incredibly hard for him to nail a shot and pull aggro off of Mothra. After a while, the High Elf thought she'd try her luck in the Alien Ruin, a Nutwill. Daltmer ran inside and Shaliz followed suit. Guarding the exterior were two imps, and I think because they made a move against Hildara, the bodyguard decided to stay outside and focus his efforts on them. From here, a lot of time ended up passing. I thought for sure that Shalise was going to catch her, strike her down, and then come back outside. I also could have seen the enemies inside of the ruin doing my job for me. What actually ended up happening though was Hildara made it out, but Shalise was nowhere to be found. This was probably the worst outcome. Now I had to venture through this dangerous dungeon in search of my already dangerous mark. Fortunately, just stepping foot inside a nutwill was seemingly enough to move the Argonian back outdoors. When this happened, Shalise had finally shifted her attention onto the bodyguard, and the rest was history. The soldier defeated my mark and both of the imps. Again, the real heroes are the ones we meet along the way. While I no longer had an interest in collecting more armor, Shalise did have an enchanted short sword. Those 5 extra points of fire damage would go a long way with some of my upcoming targets. Speaking of which, my next contract was a bit of a doozy. I knew it would be. Alva Luvani is a very powerful spellcaster. Setting up the pen and taking him out in the woods would be a really tricky challenge. What's more, he spends a lot of time in crowded spaces, like taverns. Those would be really difficult to get in and out of without incurring the wrath of the guards. So for this one, I thought I'd resort to a tried and true method. I've yet to kill off any of my targets with a poisoned apple. I knew that with Uvani, he's prone to picking up consumables off of tables. That's the whole workaround for his contract. So, tracking him down at the Lonely Suitor Lodge, I began to place poisoned apples all around the inn, on tables and even in his inventory. There might have been some other casualties here as well, but that was a sacrifice I was willing to make. Whatever happened, I needed to see this Dunmer go down via poison. After waiting around for a bit, I started to lose some hope. Nothing was happening, and I had already started to plan my assault on him back at his home in Leeuwin. However, just as I was packing up, I saw that his health bar was draining. Having accidentally seen the effects of the apple earlier, I knew that he had bitten into one. Within moments, the Dark Elf was dead, and I had free access to his Dagger of Numbing. Again, a great option for future contracts. I also got a hold of his house key. I debated on paying it a visit, but at the end of the day, I already had the Black Hand robes, so I didn't bother with collecting duplicates. With the end in sight, I just had a few more quests to go. From the get-go, I knew exactly how I was going to deal with Havelstein Horblood. I could use the Gerals to my advantage and bait him off a cliff. This worked wonders once, why wouldn't it work again? Well, maybe I just got really lucky the last time I did this, because this method would end up killing Litterbox before it could kill the Nord. Plus, like Perennia Draconis, Horblood has a pet with him, one that could easily tear me to shreds on its own. I tried the brave method of fighting back, but it didn't end too well. Finally, after picking a more direct path down the mountain, I made a few ankle-breaking leaps and got the journal update. With Havelstein dead, I could take his enchanted axe and move on to the next one. Okay, maybe not quite, but at least I was able to lose Redmaw. At this point, all I had to do was challenge Ungolem. After that, I could pop some bottles of Tamika's vintage wine. I was fairly confident for following a lead, although I would have to face off against a dog. And then for Honor Thy Mother, well, at least I'd have Arkwin fighting by my side. First things first though, I had to finish A Kiss Before Dying. As expected, rounding the corner to Breville's center was enough to get the fight going. I was fairly certain that one of the Bosmer's flaming arrows would send me to my grave instantly. So I had to sprint behind one of the guards and hope that the shot would connect with him as opposed to me. Call it my lucky day, because all it took was that one hit to pull the city into the fight. It was Ungolem against Breville's finest. I tracked the brawl from the rooftops and rooted for both sides. Obviously, I wanted the watch to come out on top here, but it would have been fun to see Ungolem take a few of them out with him. Plus, more loot for me. Well, at the end of the day, only one NPC died, but it was what needed to happen for quest progression. As soon as the Wood Elf's body hit the floor, I could finally relax. The hard part was over. The rest of the questline was going to be business as usual. Checking over the Wood Elf's body, Ungolem wielded a bow of embers. Shadow Hunt was my preferred choice for ranged attacks, but its enchantments were running out, so the Bow of Embers would be a great replacement. Because Ungolem's house was right there, I decided to loot what I could from it. There were some things that were usable but weren't upgrades, or there were things that I just no longer had uses for. Basic weapons and armor, Cyrodiilic brandy, gold ingredients, just items that were a few quests too late. Either way, when ready, I went through with following a lead. Most of it is just investigative work. There's not much to take and there's not many NPCs to kill. I did have an interesting encounter. Ulfgar Fogeye worked real hard to stay away from me. I had never seen the Nord do something like this before, and I thought it was only fitting for this playthrough. In any case, key in hand, I broke into the lighthouse cellar and faced down the bane of this quest, the crazed dog. Luckily, this was an easier encounter than I had thought. The dog's attack animations were pretty easy to predict. A simple backstep out of the way, and I had a good 2-second opening to get some licks in. I managed to come out of the fight unscathed and thought to myself, hey, that's kind of an accomplishment. In any case, with all of that taken care of, I was free to take the trader's diary and head for Apple Watch. Well there, I made sure to swap out the stolen Blackhand garb for the owned copies. There was no good reason for this, but I guess call it the honorary second last gear swap for this questline. When I felt good and ready, me and the rest of the Blackhand entered the Night Mother's crypt and the final battle ensued. This was it, my last obstacle for the Dark Brotherhood storyline while on max difficulty and only using items presented by the questline. As soon as Matthew Bellamont started swinging, I did the most Khajiit thing I could think of and jumped for my life. Landing on the nearby sarcophagus, this created the appropriate distance between me and the traitor. Using the Bow of Embers, I was able to get a plethora of potshots off at Bellamont. After he realized that there was no reaching me with his dinky little dagger, he refocused his efforts on the Night Mother. Truthfully, this tussle ended up lasting a lot longer than I thought it would have. I was certain that Arquin was going to put him down almost immediately, but that wasn't the case. She slashed away, I loosened as many arrows as I could, and the Night Mother just sort of stood there. Thanks Sithis, nothing can actually happen to her, or else by now, she'd be gone for good. Either way, it didn't matter. Arquin had constant DPS over the traitor, the Night Mother was our tank, and I was the underleveled guy who's just along for the ride. I literally knocked my last arrow, let it fly, and Matthew Bellamont dropped dead. That was it. The questline had come to an end. Admittedly, there was some amazing loot in here that 100% would have come in handy, but it's not like I could have done anything with it at this point. My time running through the Dark Brotherhood questline on max difficulty, while only using items that were acquired from the storyline, is at an end. And now, here are my thoughts. Max difficulty is hard, like really hard. I knew it wasn't going to be a walk in the park, but I didn't think every encounter with another life form was going to be terrible. Even the nuisance creatures were terrifying to go up against. What's worse, it's not like it gets that much better, okay? Technically it does as stats start to increase and powerful enchantments plus spells can be created, but that's a long way away. Plus, the enemies only get tougher as the player levels up. The bandits get worse, nuisance creatures turn into mountain lions and bears, and the undead go from basic skeletons to heroes and liches. Really, it seems like max difficulty has the reverse effect of later Elder Scrolls games. It makes early game more difficult, and if you make the necessary preparations, late game becomes easier. For the Dark Brotherhood, there were times that I looked back on and thought, maybe I should have fought this enemy or went about this contract differently. I think I was so afraid of getting decimated that there were moments where I didn't even try to duke it out. I just sort of let other NPCs handle the fighting when maybe I should have trusted myself more. I think when I do another hard difficulty run, I'll be sure to at least try and engage with more of the enemies. This way, if and when I get torn to pieces, at least I could say that I went for it. Now with that being said, that is one of the reasons why I picked the Dark Brotherhood for my max difficulty trial run. I had the luxury of picking and choosing who I could fight and what the terms for our battle would be. It was almost like an appetizer for the rest of a beefed up Cyrodiil. If I had to run through, say, the Mages Guild or the Fighters Guild like this, I think I'd still be stuck on a rat problem or one of the recommendations. However, that'll be something I could soon put to the test. Now, as for the only use items from this questline portion, that went a little different from what I had expected. I thought I'd have a more frequent flow of upgrades and that every contract or so, something new would come my way. Technically, that was more or less true with the weapons, as I found myself flipping through my arsenal somewhat frequently, but not so much for the armor. Like I said, I put away the shrouded armor in hopes of having a rotating door of pieces, but I stuck with the same kit for a majority of the storyline. I came across a lot of heavy armor, and there were times where it maybe could have come in handy, but I didn't see much light armor. Furthermore, when I did come across them, they weren't exactly any better than my fur pieces. So I think I was a little underwhelmed with that aspect, but the weaponry was exactly what I had hoped for. I had a clean flow of blades, bows, hammers, and axes reaching Litterbox's hands, and that made it incredibly fun. If anything though, I think the Dark Brotherhood is a little too generous. Of all the questlines, I think the player gets easy access to some of the most unique weapons in the game. There isn't a whole lot of scavenging dead bodies, again like the Mages Guild and the Fighters Guild, but things like Sufferthorn and Shadowhunt are worth a whole lot more than say 10 Iron War Axes. It's also an argument that you can make for the Shrouded Armor and all of the enchanted jewelry. They kind of just fall into your lap after properly finishing the quests. This is something that I didn't fully take into consideration, and I think for the next challenge run that's similar to this one, it's an aspect that I'll keep in mind. Also, really quick, I knew vampirism was going to throw a wrench into the flow of things, but that's exactly what I wanted. I was really pleased with the obstacles that it added to this playthrough. You know, just a bit of spice to add on top of things. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what kind of challenge run I should do next for Oblivion, and until next time, keep on adventuring.